So my name is Jo Fern. I am the project coordinator for the Tanaku Extension Project. Ellesmere Sustainable Agriculture received funding through the Jobs for Nature, through MPI, and that led to the establishment of the Tanaku Project. The aims of the Tanaku Project were to create jobs, to enhance biodiversity and mahinga kai values in the area, and also to improve water quality. Lots of good work was done in the first year. The project created employment for 20 people. 24 restoration projects were implemented, and also regular monthly water quality monitoring over 4 streams in the area. During that first year of the project, it became clear that further work needed to be done in the local area to help members of ESAI and others. So further funding was granted, and this led to the creation of the Tanaku Extension Programme. So the goals of the Extension Programme was to compile a database of baseline data from our members through conducting surveys. So those of you that are members, I'm sure some of you will have had those surveys done on you. So that's really going to help us moving forward. It also involved implementing a communications plan. So that was regular newsletters, setting up the website, social media pages, and also getting some good stories into the local media. Running workshops and information events like this is guided towards helping our members and others in the local community gain skills and knowledge to help with compliance with new regulations and requirements that are coming through. So thank you once again for coming today. An important part of the work that we do is getting feedback from you on the workshops that we're conducting. So you'll see in front of you that there is a feedback form. It is anonymous. If you wouldn't mind filling that in and getting it back to me by the end of the day. You'll see that we're also videoing the event today. That is so that anybody that didn't have their vaccine passes is able to watch this at a later date. It will be available through our website on our YouTube channel. I'm going to be passing around a media form just so that you're in agreement, because I'll also be taking some pictures. So if anybody doesn't want to be on film or doesn't want to have pictures of themselves, please say so. All right, so I'd like to introduce our first speaker. This is Kieth Woodford. He is Professor of the Agri-Food Systems at Lincoln University. So he will be our first speaker. He will take a few questions during his speech, but we don't want to get too bogged down in questions to start with. We will have questions after he's done his PowerPoint presentation. After Kieth, we're going to be doing morning tea for about 15 or 20 minutes. And after that, Lucy and Sarah from Beef and Lamb will be talking. So, Kieth, I'll hand the floor to you.
Right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I think back to when I first got involved, sort of, the Ellesmere district, was as a first-year Lincoln University student in 1966. And I ended up, at the end of that first year, I worked for a farmer over at Cecil Todd. His son Derek is still there. And we used to come out to the lake at weekends and do all sorts of things there, a bit of water skiing, etc. So it's great to be here today. So yes, I'm long retired from Lincoln University, so I now just work for my own little company, Agri-Food Systems, on a whole range of different topics. I still have an office at Lincoln, but my title there is honorary, which actually means they don't pay me anymore. So I sing for my supper. Okay, so we've got a few topics to work through, and we do have a PowerPoint here, and that's for sort of 2 reasons. Gives a little bit of structure, and if I should happen to have a senior moment, then I've always got the PowerPoint to bring me back on track again. So a few issues to cover, and the first slide just tells us, what's the journey of discovery and discussion for the next hour or so. I'm not going to talk for quite that long because we need to have some discussion. Questions of clarification, etc., that's fine. Let's take any of those as we go along. But the in-depth discussion probably needs to be sort of towards the end. I'm going to start by saying something about why I remain an optimist about New Zealand's agriculture. I think that's important. You know, we're in a phase at the moment where there's a lot of unhappiness, concern. You know, product prices are good, but people are pretty unhappy in agriculture. Well, I want to just share with you briefly why I remain an optimist about New Zealand's agriculture. Second, why climate change is important, but let's not be too alarmist. I'm certainly not an alarmist, and I'll explain a little bit about that, but it is important. We've got to do something about it. Third, what has New Zealand signed up to in relation to climate change, and therefore how that impacts us in agriculture? Fourth, really big topic which gets people so confused, why short-lived gases need to be considered separately to long-lived gases. A lot of us in agriculture understand that, sort of, but then sometimes we get a bit off track from thereafter. But the broader community, of course, doesn't understand that. Fifth, the role of the Emission Trading Scheme, ETS, and why it's problematic for agriculture. Sixth, something about the potential and the challenges of Hei Waka Eka Noa, which is the grouping of 11 industry partners plus MPI plus Ministry for Environment, which is trying to come up with an alternative to the emission trading system for agriculture. And wow, there's lots of consternation and controversy about that right now. And although I'm not formally within that system, it's certainly taking up quite a lot of my time, which I'll tell you a little bit about. Seventh, what can farmers do about their greenhouse gases right now? Now, one of the things in the title, I didn't put forestry up there, but forestry sort of interacts with quite a lot of these things. And although in the presentation I'm not going to say much about that, more than happy to get into that discussion in terms of how it impacts on these issues here. And those of you who read Farmers Weekly, let me think, must be, yes, this week and the last, should have been out yesterday. I've got one of my fortnightly articles, this time it's on some of the forestry issues that are also blowing up at the moment. Okay, so why am I an optimist about New Zealand's agriculture? Well, it's pretty simple really, because there's no other option for New Zealand. We are an export-led country. There are just so many things we cannot produce for ourselves that we have to import. The money for that has to come from exports. Right now, 83%, or it might be 82.6% last time, of our export income comes from primary industries: agriculture, forestry, fishing. Remarkable, isn't it? Now, these current times are a little bit unusual because some of our service industries aren't doing quite as well. But there's the bottom line, 83%. We would be in not just trouble, it would be a disaster if agriculture wasn't working for us. If agricultural exports decline, then the exchange rate will also decline. In fact, it will crash. And returns per unit of product will rise because of that. So ironically, if things turn to custard, then agriculture itself will still survive. But there'll be no money for pharmaceuticals. There'll be no money for fuel for us all to drive around. There'll be no money for all the big machinery or anything else. People say we're going to have artificial food, and I hear from Wellington that there's people there with influence who think that we're going to be able to produce artificial milk and artificial beef and all these things. Well, we can, but don't ever forget that it still requires energy to produce. You can't just make this magic food out of nothing without a source of energy. And what's the key source of energy that we use? It's that thing up there called the sun. And it works through agriculture, photosynthesis, etc. Very easy to make some artificial food using fossil fuels, but hey, that's what we're trying to eventually have to get away from. But although I'm optimistic about the agriculture in the long term, as population and inequalities increase, and with constrained resources, I am becoming a little less optimistic about New Zealand's future as a nation. Because as a nation, we do not understand, most people don't understand what drives our economy, and they don't understand the basics of where energy comes from, that big red thing, orange thing up in the sky. There's a real disconnect. So, we've all got a huge task, even old fellas like me, to keep singing the story, trying to create better understanding out there. Okay, so why is climate change important? But let's not be alarmist. Well, the world is warming. It has been for about 200 years. You can argue about the date, but you can sort of go back to the 1700s, somewhere around there, where things started to warm, as globally we were coming out of the Little Ice Age. And hey, our glaciers stopped coming forward again in New Zealand. The Little Ice Age was pretty cold, and when you look at our big lakes around the mountains, you can see, hey, when we came out of the Ice Age, the glaciers receded for about 20,000 years. And it was only in the last 1,000 years that they came forward again. Wow. But that stopped. And if we look at glaciers like the Tasman Glacier, that's a slow one to respond. That reached its maximum close to the end of the, round about the 1890s, somewhere around about there. On the west coast it was 100 years earlier. But okay, the warming's been going on now for 200 years. Started before the Industrial Revolution, and so at least in the period through to 1950 was unlikely to have been predominantly due to humans. Since 1950, there's been somewhere between 0.5 degrees and 1 degree centigrade of warming here in New Zealand. That comes from the 7-station record, which is what we predominantly use. With Lincoln, it's just away from the campus now, but Lincoln being one of those 7 stations where we can record reasonably accurately what's been going on for over 100 years. So what we say in New Zealand at the moment, that our temperatures are increasing at about 0.1 of a degree every 10 years. Globally, it's a little bit more, depends which series you use. The one I use has got us going globally about 0.14 of a degree every 10 years. So it's significant, but maybe it's not a total crisis. And there's still debate as to how much of that is actually a function we're still coming out of the Little Ice Age, and how much of it is anthropogenic. But the consensus is, which doesn't mean to say it's always quite right, the consensus in the mainstream is that most of it in the last 50 years has been due to humans, anthropogenic. The big 3 greenhouse gases that have been increasing are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. They're the big 3. There's a few other little ones as well, like the ones that have traditionally been used in refrigerators, etc., etc. But these are the big ones. Interesting is that the likelihood is that currently global temperatures are still slightly less than where they were some 2,000 years ago. You won't see that in the newspapers. I don't write for Stuff or the Herald anymore. I have at times, but it's just too constraining what you're allowed to say. Now, this isn't saying that climate change isn't important. That's not the message at all. But it's really hard in New Zealand to get a rational debate which isn't driven by outcomes or by perspectives. So you have one group of people saying that it's a crisis, the world's going to be destroyed by it. You've got other people saying, no, it's a total non-issue. Come on, both of those positions need to be brought together a little bit. As for sea levels, they're increasing at about 3.5 centimetres per decade, about 35 millimetres per year. It's pretty tiny. But they have doing so for close on 20,000 years. And in those 20,000 years, the sea has risen about 130 metres. I might have that a bit light actually, it could be a bit more than that. So, you think of what the world was like 20,000 years ago. Well, basically you could walk from Asia through to Australia. New Zealand would have looked totally different. There you go. Big things happening. So, what has New Zealand signed up to? And this is important. At Paris in 2015, we signed up to the Paris Agreement to take major steps to reduce our GHG, greenhouse gas emissions. And to some extent, it doesn't matter what I think or someone else thinks, this is what we've signed up to. We've committed to reduce net emissions of long-lived gases by 30% by 2030. And to be carbon neutral by 2050 for these three gases. For two gases. So the net neutrality is for carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. Methane's different. Come to that in a moment. So this is what we've signed up to. Now, since then, last year, we made a further commitment at the COP26 in Glasgow that we would actually reduce our long-lived gases by 50% on a net basis by 2030. Wow, this is really, really challenging. And our Minister of Climate, James Shaw, has said the only way we're actually going to be able to do that is to buy a whole lot of credits from overseas. So other people will make some of the savings and we'll pay them for it. Yeah? Okay. Sounds a bit like a TUI ad to me. Where I've said net there, what we're talking about emissions net of sequestration from forestry. We're not actually going to reduce our own long-lived gas emissions by 50% on a gross term. What we're going to do is also plant more trees to get sequestration that brings us to a net basis, which will be down 50% from where we were a year or two ago. Pretty challenging. Now, we've also committed to reduce methane emissions by 10% by 2030 and by at least 24% by 2050. These are commitments. It's set. It can be adjusted. Those numbers could be reviewed in 2024. But not only has the government legislated this now, but most of society thinks this should happen, based, of course, not always on very good understanding. But that's the framework that we've got to work within right now. What happens to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? Well, carbon dioxide stays there for a very long time, probably many hundreds of years, although it's actually quite tricky to know how long carbon dioxide does stay, but probably many hundreds of years. And the main carbon sink in the long run is in the oceans and down, way down to the ocean floor. Lots of circulation going on. Carbon dioxide is jumping back and forwards between the atmosphere and the ocean all of the time. Huge patches back and forwards. But a bit of it does sink down eventually into the deep oceans. Methane, when methane's in the atmosphere, that eventually breaks down to carbon dioxide and water. The average residency time of the methane in the atmosphere is about 12 years. But each molecule is approximately 85 times as powerful as carbon dioxide in terms of its greenhouse gas effects while it's in the atmosphere. Not there for very long, only on average 12 years, but while it's there, it is very powerful as a greenhouse gas. About 84, 85 times is the current estimates. Nitrous oxide. We don't talk so much about nitrous oxide, but we should. It's very stable, and that has an average residency time in the atmosphere of about 120 years. Its greenhouse gas effect has been estimated as 298 times that of carbon dioxide. Fortunately, there's not a huge amount of it, but it is very powerful and it's very, very stable in the atmosphere. It's quite a significant contributor in New Zealand, and once again, depends how you calculate it, but let's say round about 20% of our agricultural emissions are from nitrous oxide, and that depends how you calculate it. And if you did the calculations the way I'd like to see them done, that number would be greater and the methane would be less. But what you read in the newspapers, we've got let's put it this way, we've got about 8 million tonnes per annum of nitrous oxide emissions coming almost totally from agriculture, particularly from dairy, but also from sheep and beef. And this one is a worry because it stays there so long. So, why do short-lived gases need to be considered separately to the long-lived gases? Well, the standard method, it sort of came about by accident way back in about 1990, of comparing short-lived methane to long-lived carbon dioxide was to compare their warming over a period of 100 years. The global warming potential over a period of 100 years. But the comparison is based on some assumptions that were sort of made in passing in 1990 when globally people didn't think methane was all that important to the problems, and there's sort of some hidden assumptions. By doing the comparison for effects over a 100-year period, we effectively captured all of the methane's claimed warming effects, because they've all gone over that 100. Roughly, I won't go into, I'll just put it this way, there's less than 1%, probably less than 0.1% of the methane that's still there in 100 years. It's all come back through the cycle again into carbon dioxide, and it's back through photosynthesis, etc., etc. But, that's not true for carbon dioxide. Most of the carbon dioxide is still there in the atmosphere 100 years' time. And it's still there after 200 years, and still there after 300 years. So we don't take that into account at all, the way we do the calculations. So yep, we capture all the costs, all the warming of the methane, but we only capture perhaps about a third, maybe less, of the carbon dioxide. Now, if you're someone who believes that what happens after 100 years doesn't matter, then what we're doing is fine. I first started arguing that, hey, this system of 100 years was biased in about 2006 and 2007. Wow, did people come down and hit me from the environmental side of things? Oh, you're just trying to support farmers, etc., etc. So I went on and talked about other things. But I'm pretty sure I was the first person, at least in New Zealand, to argue that the idea of carbon dioxide equivalence based on the 100-year equivalence had all these hidden assumptions that was biased. But that's the way it is. Now, if we did the comparison over a period of 500 years, rather than 100 years, then we would say what one molecule of methane was equivalent not to about 28 carbon dioxide molecules, but only about 10. So any levy on methane relative to the levy on carbon dioxide on the basis of a 500-year equivalence would be about a third of the figure that we currently use. So when we talk about agriculture being 48% of our emissions in New Zealand, one of the hidden assumptions is that it's all based on 100-year equivalents. Nothing matters thereafter. Okay, we would be using a totally different figure for the importance of New Zealand agriculture to emissions if we did it on 500 years. But we don't. Globally, it's not done this way. And this issue is particularly important for New Zealand because we are big producers of dairy, beef and sheep. And as a proportion of our economy and in a proportion of our total emissions, methane and nitrous oxide are so important. For most countries, it doesn't really matter because the vast majority is coming from carbon dioxide. But it's so different to us. Crucial for us. Okay, there's also another way of looking at it. Because methane has a short life in the atmosphere, methane is leaving the atmosphere all the time. Here in New Zealand, the methane emitted by agriculture has been approximately constant for 20 years. The amount from dairy's gone up because we've got a lot more dairy. The amount from sheep's gone down. Beef is sort of along this, not too much change, bit of a change there. But when you add it all together, the amount of methane going out into the atmosphere from agriculture is pretty constant for the last 20 years. Now, because of that approximate constancy, what it means right now is that if you think of this invisible cloud up there in the sky of methane that has come from New Zealand agriculture, the cloud isn't actually growing at the moment. Because what we're putting out, what the cows and the sheep that are putting out, is about the same as what's disappearing, turning back into carbon dioxide, where it does so much less damage. Right, so there we are. This is long enough that the flow of new molecules into the atmosphere approximately balances the number of old methane molecules leaving the atmosphere by breakdown to CO2 and water. So we've reached a stable state where the invisible atmospheric cloud of methane from New Zealand agriculture is stable. So if we continue doing what we're doing now, then the New Zealand agriculturally sourced methane, considered by itself in isolation, will not cause the climate to warm any further. Can't really argue about that statement. I don't think our industries have made the argument very well, but that shouldn't be controversial. Okay, but that doesn't mean to say that methane isn't important. Because, well, so does that mean that methane does not need to reduce and therefore should not be levied? Well, I don't think it does mean that at all. And here's the reason why. It's not that simple. The fact is that each new molecule of methane released into the atmosphere does cause warming relative to what would happen if it were not released into the atmosphere. So there's an argument that just because too much methane was released in the past, it doesn't justify continuing to do so now. By this argument, the agriculture community is still duty bound to try and reduce methane emissions. And that is also what both National and Labour political parties in New Zealand signed up to. So of course did the Greens. ACT didn't sign up because Mr Seymour was late coming to the vote. But I believe he was reluctantly going to sign up to it as well. Okay. I just want to spend a second or two talking further about the idea that just because we did it in the past doesn't justify continuing to do so now. You can't totally dismiss that argument. If you've been doing something bad for a long time, bad, in inverted commas, that doesn't necessarily justify you doing it now. You know, you can think of all sorts of things that we did in the past, and just because we did them in the past doesn't mean we should continue to do them now. So our society, our government, our nation has decided that we need to do something about methane. And that's where I go along with that, in the sense it doesn't matter what I personally think, but okay, we have a government for a purpose, and that's what they think at the moment. We can debate that with them, but the rules of the game at the moment are that we are going to have to do something about both methane and nitrous oxide. And the current legislation says that we're going to do that through the emission trading system. The legislation's in place, and it will start in 2025. Unless the industry comes up with a better way of doing it. So the problem for agriculture is that the legislation is in place for agriculture to enter the ETS at the start of 2025. If that happens, it won't be nice. The short-term cost to agriculture will be minor to 2025 and through to 2030, but then it starts to get real nasty. Because what happens is initially agriculture will get a 95% discount. But that'll come down by 1% every year to 2030. And then the expectation is it'll come down by 2% through to 2040. And then it comes down by 3% a year. Now if that happens, and if the carbon price is up, let's say it could go to $250, the Climate Change Commission thinks that's where it has to go. So does Mr Shaw. Perhaps most importantly is the Climate Change Commission thinks it has to go there. Well, by 2040 and beyond, you can forget about beef and sheep. Dairy might be able to pay, but for beef and sheep, those sorts of prices which are needed to get people the rest of the community to drive their cars less and make all sorts of changes, those sorts of prices are enough to totally crash sheep and beef. So the emission trading scheme is not a nice place for agriculture to be in. That's because the carbon price needed to change consumer behaviours, for example, fossil fuel use, is much greater than the carbon price that will destroy agriculture. That's the fundamental problem that the government did not foresee when they first brought in the emission trading scheme in 2008. So if that occurs, we're in the emission trading scheme, then my optimism for agriculture is gone. It's all evaporated. And certainly my optimism for New Zealand is gone, because we have to have agriculture. But what's happened? The government has offered a potential lifeline, and it's called Hei Waka Eka Noa. By gosh, I've had to say that to myself many times over the last few months till it sort of flows off my tongue. Hei Waka Eka Noa. And that actually means, the meaning of that is, hey, we're all in this together. Well, there's 11 industry groups in there: beef and lamb, Dairy New Zealand, the deer industry, FAR, Foundation Arable Research. They're all in there, plus government sitting there on the sideline, but always present at the meetings. So what is this thing called Hei Waka Eka Noa, which is our potential lifeline, but which there's a lot of controversy about, and groups like Groundswell, I've tried to work with them to bring them into the fold a little bit, but I say, no, let's throw the bomb at the whole thing. Okay, well, if your bomb goes off, then we're into the ETS. I don't like that. So I'd prefer to work with Hei Waka Eka Noa and get it right. HWEN for short. It's a partnership, 11 industry groups, plus reps from MPI and Ministry for Environment. The industry groups said to government at the start that they wanted to come up with a better levy than the emission trading system. So the government said, okay, have a go at it. See what you can come up with. What is really interesting and of huge importance, the government actually gave HWEN the green light to develop a split gas approach, which essentially recognised that methane did not have to be charged on the basis of 100-year carbon dioxide equivalents. They said, have a go at it, see what you can come up with. It doesn't have to be on that basis. That was a huge win for the agricultural sector. The leaders haven't skited about that from the rooftops and whatever. They've just quietly said, well, what a relief. If they did skite about it, then that might set up a whole lot more opposition. Okay, this is something we can now work on. Huge step forward, which hasn't been recognised even within the community, agricultural committee. Some other advantages of Hei Waka Eka Noa. The government has indicated its willingness, hasn't absolutely committed, but willingness to recycle all methane and nitrous oxide revenues back into the sector to fund research, development, extension and education relating to greenhouse gases, and for the funding of mitigation strategies. So it'll all be recycled. It won't just go into the government pot, this tax. It's a huge step forward. But it still needs to be locked in. So they've said they're willing, yep, but they haven't actually, nothing's committed yet. But the combination of split gas levies plus a commitment to recycling, round and round, should ensure that levies remain modest. It's no longer a tax on agriculture. Rather, it's a levy to make sure that we do the research, development, etc., which we've got to do if we're going to reduce our emissions, find out how we can reduce our emissions further. We've got to do that, and then we've got to incentivise the early movers to come in and do the mitigation strategies. But that's not a frightening cost. Nothing like the carbon price and the emission trading system. But hey, we've got to get that levy system, we've got to work out exactly how we're going to do it. And that is a little bit tricky. So there's been 2 proposals, broad proposals, which HWEN has put out. I think they've done a terrible job of communicating that. We also know that one of the systems, the farm levy, the government itself, and the ministers are saying, hey, we don't actually think you can get that together and make it work. But HWEN actually decided just yesterday, I'm told, this isn't in the media, but they decided yesterday, yep, we're going to make that one work. We think we can. That's the one that farmers want. Really important, the Paris Agreement says that the levy system must not threaten food production. But the industry hasn't really used that, and it needs to use it much more strongly. So I've been pointing this out, that that's what we signed up to. Whatever we did would not threaten food production. But I've had senior people in our industry saying, oh, no, that was really just for developing countries. And I said, no, you go back and read the agreement. And here is the agreement. You will find absolutely no qualification in the Paris Agreement to that statement that whatever we do for climate change must not threaten food production. Pretty comforting, isn't it? Hey, we've got a few things on our side. But I don't think our industry has really sold that argument very well. But challenges do remain within He Waka Eke Noa, no doubt about that. It's not across the line now. There's a lot of fighting within the sector, with many farmers, in groundswell in particular, seeing it as a tax to be fought. There's also lots of debate as to the specifics of the system, and I've just touched on that there's a farm-based system and another one where it sort of works through the processes and into a so-called hybrid, very poorly explained in the documentation, 50 pages of it, oh my gosh, and it's a dog's breakfast. So there's a lot of debate about that, and that debate isn't just amongst farmers, it's actually amongst the partners as well. There's significant disagreement amongst the partners as to how it should go on. I'm told that the meetings are pretty lively at times. So HWEN partners have got to take some responsibility that they haven't quite got things right. You know, we can give the industry a huge pat on the back for getting the government to agree, hey, yeah, we'll look at a split gas approach. But then we have to say, hey, you could have done a whole lot better in terms of how you've communicated this stuff, which is a dog's breakfast. But that's what happens sometimes when you've got all those many partners involved. So a lot more work is now needed to develop the specific HWEN proposal, and this means going right back to the drawing board. There's some pressures there. The government is saying you've got to have it all sorted out by May. And when I hear that from the industry leaders, I say, no, well, I don't think the government is actually quite saying that. You've got to get the principles in place by the end of May. But no, you've got more time to work on the details. But hey, there's a lot of work to happen. Note that HWEN, He Waka Eke Noa, is specific to greenhouse gases. Other ecosystem services lie outside of that. So for example, a lot of you will be involved in riparian strips and all sorts of areas there which create big ecosystem services. But hey, that can't be within HWEN. There's been a lot of confusion about that. HWEN has to be for levies related to methane and nitrous oxide, which are used to reduce emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. Once you start getting into sequestration issues and once you start getting into other ecosystem services, which are incredibly important, hey, but that's different. They come out of different funding buckets. A lot of confusion about those things. And we've got to get all of the carbon sequestration into the ETS rather than HWEN. So Beef and Lamb have gone and sold it to their farmers that, yeah, we're going to have all the sequestration that's not in the ETS, we'll handle it through HWEN. Hey, come on. That means you're going to charge farmer Peter Farmer over here, based on his methane and nitrous oxide, to pay Paul Farmer over here for the sequestration that he's doing. And that just pushes up your levies. What we've got to do is get more things into the ETS, which means then that it's society and all the other emitters who are paying for those benefits, rather than Farmer Peter paying Farmer Paul. So as soon as you have sequestration in HWEN, then you've got to say, oh, how are we going to get this equivalence now again between the methane and the carbon sequestration? Oh gosh, we've got to go back to some carbon dioxide equivalence. Right back into all the problems where we started from. No, we're split gas now. We just talk about kilograms of methane and kilograms of nitrous oxide. Once you bring carbon from forests into, or any other form of sequestration, riparian strips, etc., then you're right back into carbon dioxide equivalents, and you've broken down the advantages of the split gas, and you're in a situation where not only are you now simply transferring funds from one group of farmers to another group of farmers, but you're tying it up in a whole lot of administration costs as well. Now, there are some flaws with sequestration in the emission trading scheme, but there's potential to get those solved. For example, some of the native regeneration rules are really, really difficult to follow. They're essentially anomalies in the system. We don't have to go to Paris or anywhere else to sort those things out. All we have to make sure, if it's in the emission trading system, is that it is genuine sequestration. Don't go and put it into HWEN. So, bringing the focus back to the farm. Yep, we've got to finish in a minute. What can farmers do about their greenhouse gases right now? Well, not a hell of a lot. But don't despair, there are new technologies coming through. It's unlikely to be a case of any one technology solving the problem, but achieving the 10% emission reduction for methane by 2030 should be feasible. Even if only just, it should be feasible without decreasing production. We're actually quite fortunate that increasing biological efficiency, increasing economic efficiency, and reducing emission intensity, they're often aligning. If you're doing one, you're doing the other. And we've actually made progress over the last 20 years, because quite a lot of the things that we've done relating to economic efficiency and biological efficiency have actually reduced the emissions per kilogram of milk solids or per kilogram of beef or sheep. So some specifics, and this is Northern. For sheep farmers, higher lambing percentages, lower death rates, higher carcass weights will all reduce emission intensity, meaning less emissions from the same level of production. For dairy farmers, high milk solids production per kilogram of live weight will become an important KPI, key performance indicator, to reduce emission intensity. You know, we've seen a lot of information in the last year or so about how we're the most efficient in relation to methane intensity. Hey, come on, let's go back to the scientific paper which showed that and have a look at all the caveats that are on it. And one of the caveats is that we do the calculations differently than the other countries do. Come on now, so we've got to stop knowing the outcome we want at the start and then lobbying. But that's one important way. You know, the worst cattle farming systems for dairy production in the world are what happens in India. Low production cows, the ratio of milk that they produce compared to the amount of feed they eat is very poor. It's poor quality feed. That means you've got a lot of emissions per kilogram of milk solids. But some of the big American farms and some of the big European farms, they're right up there with us, maybe even doing better with less emissions per kilogram of milk solids. So we need to be focusing on, I work with some farmers who produce, if you've got a live weight of your cow, they produce 120% of that live weight, perhaps even a little bit more, in terms of kilograms of milk solids. And we've got a lot of other farmers around who are only at a ratio of 70%. Hey, there's quite a lot we can do there. There's a really exciting paper just coming out now talking about that. Beef farmers, faster growth rates, earlier slaughter will reduce methane intensity, as will even greater use of beef inseminated dairy cows. And go a bit further down that track here. That'll help us. Mixed cropping farmers, most of the potential reductions will come from the livestock component of their operations. Typical mixed cropping in itself, the cropping part of it doesn't have big emissions. Sure, there's some carbon dioxide from the fuel that you're using. You're already paying for that effectively through the fuel price. And for vegetable and fruit growers who have no animals, well, emissions are not going to be a significant threat to your business. Just isn't going to be a threat. The ones that are most threatened are sheep and beef. They're the ones. Returning marginal land to forestry will reduce the sector's emissions of both methane and nitrous oxide, but forestry is a big topic by itself. But there are some things that make sense to do. We can argue about the numbers, but roughly 1 million hectares of marginal land probably should go back into forestry. And, you know, I've got another session next week with some farmers. I won't be too explicit, but there's farmers and foresters. And we're actually going to go out and have a look at some land, which it's on a sheep and beef farm. It's that dirty country. It's actually low producing for sheep and beef. It costs quite a bit to maintain it, and the farmer's planting that out in trees of various types, and it's working really, really well. There is some of that should work. So that farmer is an example, and there's lots and lots of farmers like this, where forestry can actually be another income source. And putting a small proportion of your farm into forestry, which probably does have to be exotic, whole big question there, it actually can keep the whole business viable. Okay. And anything that reduces nitrogen leaching is also likely to reduce nitrous oxide emissions. Longer term reductions, they do require RD&E, E&E. There's a thing called 3-NOP, a capsule which will inhibit methane producing bacteria. Could be a game changer. It works for the big American and European systems, so they should be able to reduce their methane by about 30%, but it doesn't work at the moment for our pastoral systems. But Fonterra and others are working on it. So there's things like that. Vaccines, that's a bit tricky. You can produce the antibodies in the system, but you've got to get them into the saliva and back into the rumen. That may not happen. More work required on nitrous oxide, but there are interesting possibilities. I won't go into them now, but I'm part of a group that's been trying to get some funding for some of those initiatives, and we haven't succeeded so far. Well, if we don't do the R&D, then we're not going to come up with the answers. So there we are, time for discussion if I've left you anything. If we can't cover your questions now, come up at morning tea. And although the odd email has been known to get lost in my system, I do try to answer emails, and there's my email address down the bottom. So thanks for listening to me. From my perspective, it's always fun, enjoyable to talk to a group like this. Okay, discussion and morning tea.
High country farmers livestock stock units are pretty low, so if you're saying increase stock units, things like that, but it's not practical for that side of it, then you're saying planting trees, but if you're on pastoral lease, they don't let you plant trees. So where are you situated there?
High country farmers are in a very interesting situation for multiple reasons. As you say, there's rules around pastoral leases which need to be addressed. High country farmers do have an issue because the feed quality isn't just the nature of land. The feed quality is going to be lower megajoules of metabolizable energy, and therefore the animals take longer to grow. And so the hard reality is that animals coming off produced on the high country do have quite high emissions per unit of meat that's produced. You can't get away from that. A lot of the high country does have some potential for forestry of different types, not all of it. I'm associated with one high country property where looking at putting in an area of trees. It'll still remain a sheep and beef farm, but the forestry can be quite important. There's another high country property which I have a bit of a link to, and that's got a lot of regeneration going on into native, which isn't in the ETS because the bureaucracy is just too tough. Now, that's something that has to be sorted out. It can't be sorted out within HWEN, but if that sequestration is brought into HWEN, for one of the farms I have a link with, then the sequestration for that farm alone, HWEN will end up paying well over $1 million per annum for sequestration. But hey, that's just coming money from other farmers. What we've got to do is get it into the emission trading system where it should be. If we work from the base, a really key issue is that, well, first of all, I acknowledge some of the high country runs are going to be affected more than some of the low country properties for a range of reasons. But if we can get the focus away from a carbon tax, the emission trading system, and if we can link it to, we start from asking the question, what are the research, development, and then extension education tasks we need to take on? How much money do we need for that? And when we come up with mitigation strategies, how much money do we need to get the first movers into it and to make it all happen? The levies should be a huge, just a tiny fraction of what would be required if it's in the ETS.
Keith, following on from that, it gets back to economics and GDP for New Zealand. Following on from that conversation, this room probably, I don't know what the percentage in this room is, but arable farmers, and your slide 3 back said to them, don't have livestock because that's a pain for them. 90% plus is income from arable crops and not. That is an absolute Achilles heel that's going to be smacked off the sheep and beef farms if you want efficiency of output and low emissions. If we are going to discount the likes of this country to finished lambs that are born effectively on hill country and sold store. So the unintended consequences will be that we'll lose sheep and beef stock units because arable finishers will go, why the hell do we want to place anything in this game and just continue to put a crop in? So we could kill the industry, and I hope that message is getting through to the group, because the unintended consequences is we could just keep shrinking productivity, shrinking sheep numbers, and taking them off this good finishing country that are going to efficiently grow them 300 grams a day and get them out the gate with a low carbon footprint.
Okay, so big issues there. My argument is that the levies have to fall where the emissions actually occur. And then we work from that position. To the extent that the high country moves away from sheep and beef, it should only be where forestry is indeed the right tree in the right place, which is easy to say, but there's a whole lot of debate for every situation as to where that is occurring. So, I mean, He Waka Eke Noa isn't going to be a gift from heaven, but what I'm saying is that I think that we can, or they can, because I'm not part of the formal system, potentially develop a system which leads us in the right direction and allows agriculture to still be, highly profitable. And there's another property I was out at, so actually it wasn't high country, this was on Banks Peninsula recently, where there's a whole lot of different classes of land. And there's one area there where the farmer actually had it in trees, but took it out of trees. And he was commenting about how it's now producing wonderful pasture. And it's funny enough, I go for a walk up Kennedy's Bush area quite often, and I look at some of the areas there that were in trees, and they got burnt down, been taken down, and I look at the pasture that's now growing there. Incredible pasture that's growing. So you can get trees back into pasture when that's the right thing. I don't think I can answer all of your questions here, except to say that I think if we just take each situation logically, then I don't think this has to be too painful, and I think there still is a future also for the high country in sheep and beef. But I do acknowledge that emissions per kilogram of meat are going to be somewhat higher for product that comes off the high country. Yeah. Arable farmers are still, of course, going to require livestock in their systems. It's so different in the United States, where they have, the Midwest, just incredible natural fertility, although they're running it down now. And even in Britain, where, there are areas there where they've been growing continuous wheat for 150 years. Incredible, isn't it? Without livestock. There have been really long trials going on. We are in a different situation. We cannot make our farming systems work in general without a big livestock component. And that even includes the arable cropping. Yeah.
Kieth, do you have any comments or thoughts on the role that the RMA is? Oh, I'll be right. Oh. That the RMA has in this whole situation, because a lot of the things that we will probably have to do then get hit by regulation from another sphere. So farmers are in that position of, having to fight laws that say, no, they can't actually grow forestry here. And are there any discussions around that at that higher level at the moment?
Well, I think there probably are discussions at the higher level, which I'm not necessarily privy to. I just rely on messages that float in on the breeze, and which I can't always be too explicit about. I think there are big issues related to resource management in general. I think it's probably true that we haven't had that right in the past. And I hate seeing science matters deliberated within a legal situation, because so often you get that wrong. And I do personally worry at times about levels of centralisation and getting the right balance at a regional level. No easy answers on that. But one of the things I've sort of been saying with these issues we're facing now with the He Waka Eke Noa, and also the issues that the James Shaw and who's it, Damien O'Connor, they're the two that brought out the discussion paper on forestry 3 or 4 weeks ago. A battle or a war is always multifaceted. You've got to fight these issues here and you've got to fight those issues there. And if we're focusing on the emission issue, then that's got to be in the Hei-Waka-Reke-Noa camp, which we're going to have to fight that. If we're talking about other ecosystem services, forms of be it pollution or services, then we've got to fight those battles there. Each battle's got to be fought on its own merits. Yeah, and I think at the moment things have got a bit confused. Yeah. But I'm a bit scared to go too deep into the RMA today or we'd never get there. That's another huge topic.
My understanding about the split gas, and this could be completely wrong, is that New Zealand is the only country currently looking at that system, and will it be...
The only country looking at which system?
The split gas.
Oh, split gas. Yeah, I think we are ahead of anyone. It's quite remarkable that in some of these areas, we really are leaders. And we've sort of got into that situation because of our unique situation. That it's relevant for Uruguay, which I've done a bit of work there at times, and it's relevant for Ireland, where I've visited but have never worked. But there's no one quite like us for whom this is so important. Both the split gas and the specific issues with forestry were quite unique here in New Zealand. But one of the good things, it means we don't actually have to go and get permission from other countries and follow rules that other countries have put in place. Yeah.
So it doesn't need to be recognised by Paris for us to do it?
Well, there's 2 issues. There's the ETS in Hei-Waka-Reke-Noa, which are tools and how we work to make change. And then there's how we report to the UNFCCC. Now, and that is normally done using carbon dioxide equivalents. I argued strongly to the Climate Change Commission that we should be separately reporting carbon, methane, nitrous oxide. And if we can reduce methane and nitrous oxide, and we can show, hey, we've reduced this by 10% or 20%, and hey, we should get a lot of praise from the UN for that achievement. That's what it's all about. It's not meant to be about what taxes we charge agriculture. It's meant to be about what reductions in emissions we can achieve. Yeah.
Have any other countries gone on the food production, lowering the fruit, like the Paris one said it shouldn't affect the food production? Has any other country sort of gone down that line? Because I hear now Europe and UK are now ploughing up set-aside stuff because there's a food shortage.
Yeah, well, one of the consequences of the absolute tragedy across in Ukraine is that food production has started to come a bit higher in terms of what people are thinking about. And even before the Ukraine situation occurred, we had been seeing quite substantial increases in food costs. And I think we will see increasing attention. But there's certainly no OECD country that depends on agriculture in the same way that New Zealand does. So It's probably been more in the developing countries that there's been concern about food production and what we have to do, and the answers aren't easy. I don't know whether any of you have been following the situation in Sri Lanka. The government in Sri Lanka said about 18 months ago, we're going to go organic. And we're not going to import any of these fertilisers. What's happened? Well, big food shortages in Sri Lanka. Food prices are way up, and really big reductions. Now, the argument that I'm making is not against organic systems. But hey, when you try and do these things without working out how you're going to do it, and where you're going to get all your nutrients from, then you can have some really big impact. And I think we are moving into a time, into a territory when food security is going to become quite a big issue around the world, bigger than what it's been. And that, of course, just happens to align with our positioning as a country here in New Zealand. Yeah. Food production is important. Yeah.
Keith, can I just say that farmers have got various organisations representing them. These organisations are not. These organisations are not necessarily complementary. Call me old, call me stupid, but even with an ag sci degree, I can see that the situation is pretty complex in lots of dimensions. Science, politics, what have you. I think it'd be fair to say that many farmers are confused and so busy with other compliant issues right now, not to mention making a buck, and a lot of them thinking that the rest of the world are the polluting bastards anyway, and that New Zealand's such a small part of it all. So that ultimately, as we look forward to do something in New Zealand, farmers are going to rely on these representative organisations to make the change on our behalf. And when, with this cluster of all the organisations that are involved, to put it in farming terms, perhaps down the back paddock, should be put in a room somewhere and told that they can't come out of there until they develop a consensus. Because if we are going to leave it straight to a ETS system, then agriculture doesn't have a very bright future.
Look, there's no doubt right now that despite the very high prices for products in general, farmers are less happy than what they have ever been. And we're seeing this in all sorts of ways, including mental health issues. My own view is that although I'm definitely not criticising any individuals, I think the farming organisations have had some achievements, and even getting government to agree to He Wakareka Noa is something to move forward, I think was a real achievement. But I've been saying back to them, hey, that's not good enough. And the rural industries have to do better. Now, you know, in the last week, there's the steering committee for HWN. They've met once or twice, and I gather those were quite stressful meetings. I think there was a meeting of the overarching governance yesterday, and I think that might have been quite warm as well, trying to make those things happen. You know, even when you get people into the one room, they might come out with a consensus at the end, but it can sometimes be a dog's breakfast. And you've got to have some key leaders there, real leaders who can think strategically about the big picture and you've got lots and lots of people buzzing around and doing all sorts of, like buzzing bees, doing all the good work. But hey, somehow there's got to be the leadership through, and the hugely demanding task of actually communicating with the industry, with the farmers.